Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm really excited to talk to you about environmental justice and from the perspective of the state. So a lot of what I will cover will be a nice tie-in to what Dr. Sheets left off with. So a little bit of overlap, but I think the repetition will be nice. So we'll talk about what environmental justice is from the state perspective. We'll try to talk about some links between environmental decisions and racism and income discrimination. We'll talk about where New Jersey's environmental justice communities are, and then what the state of New Jersey is doing to further the promise of environmental justice. And then lastly, just a couple of thoughts to share with you on how all of you in the audience can be co-conspirators in the fight against injustice. And what I mean by co-conspirator, using this term, many folks often say, I want to be an ally to a movement, right? And I heard this example and I thought it was genius, and so I've stolen it and we'll share it with you. So say, for example, you're in a boxing match, like you're in the ring, you're fighting, you're getting beat up, and then you have an ally who's outside of the ring, right? And they're encouraging, they're cheering you on, keep going, here's some water, keep going, keep going. But how would that fight be made different if that person stepped inside the ring with you and they were fighting with you, not just outside of the ring being the bystander or being an ally, right? Supportive in words, but also supportive in action. So I think Dr. Sheets talked about some examples that he offered to you. We'll share some of those from my perspective as well. So I just want to start with, and I often do my talks asking the audience this question. We won't have that interactive moment today, but if you can just think in your mind, if you know anything about the environmental movement, what are some of the successes since 1970? Because when we talk about environmental injustice or the need for environmental justice, right, we're making the inherent assumption that something is wrong with the way that we protect our environment. And so there's been a lot of successes, so it's not to overstate or to erase the good things that have happened in this country. So if we think about the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, all these good things that help to protect our earth, right? And so this is just a very, very oversimplification of how we got here in our environment. So you can just think about, and I won't take the time to go through each plot on this timeline, right? But just start to think about how our country has grown and developed throughout the industrial age. There's been all of this innovation and success that we're proud of in this country. But what comes with that, unfortunately, is a lot of pollution. And pollution in certain areas, as we're learning today, right? And so you have the rise of industry, the rise of the car, the rise of the automobile, the highway system. And so when I think about this, and then thinking about how coupled with that, you have the pollution that comes and the recognition of that pollution, and then the laws and policies that follow to really protect our natural resources, to protect our built environment. But my question when I think about this is, where is the act that ensured the proper siting of industry? So we have all these great innovations, and at some point along the road, there has been a check on that, like a check on industry, a check on corporations. In some way, we can criticize how far that check goes, but there's the Clean Air Act, there's the Clean Water Act that tries to protect our natural resources and our environment. Not necessarily the people, and most especially the most overburdened people in that environment. And so the way that I think about it is that there have always been those who have power in our country that have known where to cite sources of pollution and where to avoid those sources of pollution. They've always known this concept of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. There's always been a sense, based on racism that we'll talk about, where are the places that are more desirable and less desirable. And so what didn't keep up with the innovation and the push to be successful in protecting our environment was also protecting the people in our environment. So we've got this push and this upward trajectory, but the protection actually has a downward trajectory. So much so that we're here talking about environmental injustice today. And so let's just go with a definition, a way to think about environmental justice. So this says, no group of people, especially due to the color of their skin, should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences, and that everyone is entitled to equal enforcement of environmental protection, not just those who are able to financially move away from a threat. And then we'll go to some environmental justice principles. You heard some of this from Dr. Sheets, that the most impacted groups speak for themselves. That environmental justice or injustices is not just about disparities, it's also about creating access to environmental benefits. We'll talk about environmental benefits a little bit later. And there is a racial gap between who causes and who experiences environmental pollution. And of course, environmental racism did not happen overnight, it is systemic. We'll talk about that a little bit later too, and kind of try to understand why it's systemic in nature. But first, I want to go through some terminology and really do some grounding for us as an audience. And you may know all of this already, and so if you do, that's great. But maybe the examples that we'll go through will help you in your discussions with colleagues who aren't so familiar with these terms, to help you give just a quick example of how you can explain that in conversations, so that we're coming from a shared place of understanding with our language, and so that we are intentional with our language, and so that we're not using terms interchangeably. So we often hear equality and equity and justice. What do we mean by that? But what do we mean by that in the context of environmental equality, environmental equity, environmental justice? Are those all the same? So let's start with this just very simple example, and let's make some assumptions here that we have two communities. Community A is more well off, they have more money, more financially stable. Community B is poor, they don't have as much money, but both communities are hungry. And so we have this really great nonprofit, kind of picture at the top right-hand corner, who is producing bread. And so they're coming up with a solution to solve this hunger issue within these two communities. We're going to produce bread, we're going to give it out so our communities don't starve from hunger, right? So what equality looks like in this example is if we only have enough resources to produce 4 loaves of bread, we're going to give community A 2 loaves of bread, we're going to give community B 2 loaves of bread. So that's equality, just divide it in half, right? But when we think about equity, let's make those same 2 assumptions about community A has more money, community B has less money, right? Same nonprofit, they're producing bread, same 4 loaves of bread, but in this scenario, we're gonna say, okay, because community B has less financial resources, they're struggling a bit more, there's suffering from poverty, we're gonna give them 3 loaves of bread, while community A will only get 1 loaf of bread. So you can think about the ways to kind of divvy up that math, but that would be equity, right? So what do we mean by justice though? So justice is looking at, the root causes of inequity. We're thinking about what are the systems that create an experience for these communities where they need to rely on the nonprofit who's baking the bread. And so this example is not to pick on the nonprofit. There are great institutions within our country that provide great service, that are of great service to our communities, right? But when we think about Band-Aid solutions or Band-Aid approaches, sometimes they don't address the root causes of where the inequity comes from. So if we think about justice in this scenario, it's not only giving out loaves of bread and trying to serve people as we best can, but it's also looking at, poverty, access to jobs, access to education that would empower a community to be able to do better, to go further for themselves, and not relying on a third party to provide that assistance. Because what happens if the nonprofit burns down? Or what happens if, because of climate change, the farm that produces the wheat that the nonprofit sources to bake the bread, something happens to the farm because of climate change, and now they can't rely on that farm to source, and so there's a delay in giving out the bread, So if we just think about this example and we take it to the environment, what would it look like to make sure that there's equal protection under the laws, right? But then we're also thinking about which communities may need more resources, may need more financial resources. It's kind of looking at the environmental equity. And then the environmental justices, before we, maybe in tandem with is a better way to put it, but we also need to be thinking about the ways in which our communities are experiencing life because of the policies and the decisions made by folks in power who are creating these experiences where these communities even have to deal with this. And so just want to talk about that. And we'll keep going with some more definitions. So when we think about environmental injustice and environmental racism. So I want to pull a quote from Dr. Robert Bullard, who's one of the foundational members of the environmental justice movement from early on in the 90s, and he currently sits on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council with Dr. Sheets. But he has said, now all of the issues of environmental racism and environmental justice don't just deal with people of color. We are just as much concerned with inequities in Appalachia, for example, where whites are basically dumped on because of the lack of economic and political clout and the lack of having a voice to say no, and that too is environmental injustice. So just want to paint a distinction here that every occurrence or every scenario of environmental racism is an environmental injustice, but not every instance of environmental injustice is based on race or occurs along the lines of race. But we know that race is the biggest predictor of whether an environmental injustice is to occur within a community. So we're going to spend some time on environmental racism, and in a very oversimplified, very quick, because I just don't have time to go through all of our country's history to talk about and try to answer the question, well, how did we get here? How did we get here to have it be the case that some communities experience more disproportionate pollution than others? And so just want to paint and make the case and argue to you that environmental racism is uniquely and intrinsically tied to the foundation of this country. Way back when, of how this country was founded and how it was started. So if we think about our founding fathers, and we know it to be a fallacy that they discovered this country, right? And so we think about the land of the indigenous people who originally inhabited this country, and the displacement and the pillaging and the murder of their communities by our founding fathers, all in the name of conquest and expansion. And we think about the outcomes of that conquest and that colonialism and that expansion and the degradation that that has caused to the natural resources that those communities, those indigenous communities, rely on, then we have to think about that under the context of environmental racism. That those environmental resources that those communities depend on have been degraded in the name of conquest and colonialism. So, that is environmental racism. We can take it, some years down the line within our history and think about redlining. And so I think that Dr. Sheets talked about, the government sanction of racism, and redlining is certainly one of the practices within our federal government in which that played out. And so again, if we go back to those who are in power, and in this instance, we're talking about the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, and the decisions that they had to, or the decisions that they took to delineate our communities, primarily Black and brown communities and some immigrant communities, to be less desirable than others, then what does that say about the health and the well-being of those communities? Over time, those communities will be suffering from a lack of disinvestment, a lack of investment, and those communities will end up where they will be sacrifice zones. And so I have a link here, I won't show it today, to just like a 40 to 60-second trailer of a film that actually features Melissa Miles, our next speaker, and a few other of our advocates in New Jersey that really talk about, this legacy of environmental racism and the way that it shows up today in our communities. So it features the Ironbound community within New Jersey, and it talks about and it paints that community as being a sacrifice zone, that those in power, those with the opportunity to make decisions, don't include the communities for which the outcomes of those decisions will affect. And that's all based on this legacy and this history of not valuing and making the assumption and the determination that these communities are less well off and that they ultimately deserve less of our attention and our support and overall valuation. So just want to leave that link and encourage you all to watch it. It's about a 40 to 45-minute film that will illuminate how this actually plays out in one of our environmental justice communities. So let me take you through what the state of New Jersey is doing to further their promise of environmental justice. And there's kind of two pieces of policy and law that I want to use as the primary pillars of how our environmental justice policy work at the state is playing out. So one is through Executive Order 23, which was signed by Governor Murphy his first 100 days in office in 2018. And so what this executive order says is that it requires each member of the executive branch, so every state, department, and agency, to consider the extent to which environmental justice is incorporated into our responsibilities as an agency, and to further add in environmental justice into our mission so that we're doing everything that we can to further environmental justice. And so one of the obvious examples of that will be the ways in which we do our regulatory responsibilities through citing. The most obvious example is our environmental justice law, which I'll talk about in a minute, but there's so many other opportunities if you think about everything that state agencies do for the state, for the people, in furtherance of our mission. There's so many opportunities to incorporate EJ. And then the second, this pictured here, is a signing of our environmental justice law. So just want to take some time first to go through some declarations. So this is right up front, page 1 of the law. If you Google it and click on it, you'll see these declarations. And these are so important because the concepts of environmental justice and environmental racism and income discrimination and how all of these issues are uniquely and intrinsically tied to how this country was started and founded and still continues to operate is not up for discussion. It's in the law, and we have these declarations that say things like, all New Jersey residents, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, color, national origin, have a right to live, work, and recreate in a clean and healthy environment. Historically, New Jersey's low-income communities and communities of color have been subject to a disproportionately high number of environmental and public health stressors, and we'll talk about that in a minute, including pollution from numerous industrial, commercial, governmental facilities located in this community, and that it is well past time for the state to correct these historic injustices. So our state legislature and our governor stand behind this. And so this is really important because it sets the foundation for our work. And there's more declarations to come after this, namely where it says it is in the public interest for the state where appropriate to limit the future placement and expansion of such facilities in overburdened communities. And so that's the pillar of what the environmental justice law says. And so we'll go through in a little bit more detail. You heard Dr. Sheets talk about it. I'll talk about the proposed regulations that we have on the books now. But before we do that, just want to go back to the definition of overburdened community. And so let's just spend another moment on this, the definition. So you only need to meet one of the 3 criteria to be categorized as an overburdened community at the block group level. And so the importance here is on the word or and not and. And the reason why we chose to do that is to provide the most protections as possible. So, 35% of households are low income, or 40% of the households are minority, or 40% of the households have limited English proficiency. And so our numbers as of 2020, I think this map is 2020, we have updated numbers from the 2021 American Community Survey that we'll be updating in our map pretty soon. But as of 2020, we have 348 of our state's 564 municipalities that have overburdened Black groups within their municipal boundaries. So about 50 to 51% of the state's population live within overburdened communities. And so just a little bit more framing on how we think about environmental justice in New Jersey and how we utilize the term environmental justice community as compared to an overburdened community. So the definition OBC, overburdened community, like I just said, is statutorily defined within the environmental justice law. So purely just based on the demographics. Now, if we layer on top the presence of disproportionate environmental and public health stressors, so this circle at the bottom in this brownish red color. So we're looking at the sources of pollution that a community, based on their demographics, are experiencing that may be disproportionate to their neighbor. So they're experiencing more pollution than their neighbor would experience, that disproportionate effect. And then we layer on top of that the absence of environmental and public health benefits. So we're talking about open space, we're talking about tree canopy, we're talking about green infrastructure, these environmental benefits. We also know that communities of color tend to not have tree canopy. They tend to be the places that flood most often, so they don't have green infrastructure. They tend to be the places where sewage will be backing up in their basements. They tend to be the places that are 10 to 20 degrees hotter than whiter and wealthier communities, right? So these lack of environmental benefits, coupled with the presence of disproportionate pollution layered on top of where communities are defined based on demographics, is how in New Jersey, at least at the state, we will define environmental justice community. So it's the nexus of those three. And so we have a tool, it's called EJMAP. So the Environmental Justice Mapping Assessment and Protection Tool. If you just Google New Jersey DEP EJMAP, it'll come right up. And so this tool allows you to map and to see the extent to which overburdened communities are distributed throughout the state. And so I just have this example of Trenton popped up on the map, and you're able to see a little legend on the left that tells you which community based on demographics is categorized as an OBC. So it could be because they're minority, low income and minority, and limited English proficient, or some combination of those three. And so you can search your address, your municipality, and you're able to see where those OBCs are located. Now you're also able to see, it's not pictured here, but there's a tab in the upper menu that says Stressor Summary. You're also able to see the extent to which those OBCs are experiencing disproportionate amounts of pollution, which is a game changer. So we're not just making the assumption or anecdotally saying that Black and brown communities are experiencing more pollution. We can actually tell you, and we can show you based on this map. And so if you click on that Stressor Summary tab, we've done all the analysis in-house within the department. And so you're able to see those indicators of pollution and which of those communities are experiencing that as compared to the communities that aren't experiencing that pollution. So there's no guesswork in this. We've done that analysis for the public and for the implementation of our environmental justice law. So the legislature has a bill, that act is signed into law by our governor, and then it implicates the Department of Environmental Protection, my agency, as the agency who has to implement the law through regulation. So right now we have a draft rule proposal on our website. You can Google it, it'll pop right up. And we will soon be adopting those laws, rules, meaning that those rules will become final and will be effective. And so this will be the way that we're operating and doing business in terms of our regulations in New Jersey once those rules are adopted. And they will be adopted pretty soon in the coming weeks. So right now, just based off what our proposal says, the law is applicable based on, we kind of think of this three-pronged test of applicability. So there's 3 criteria that you have to meet. So the first is that the applicant is proposing to be located or is located within an overburdened community. That's step 1. Step 2 is you are one of these 8 categories of facilities. So you're a major source of air pollution, you are a sewage treatment plant, you're a recycling center, you're a scrap metal facility, a landfill, and so on and so forth. You have to be within one of those 8 categories. And then the third is you're seeking an applicable permit as defined by the law from the DEP. So while this law is the first of its kind in the nation to have this authority to consider disproportionate impacts that a community experiences and can deny or set conditions on permits, while we are the first to have that authority, the authority is only narrowly defined. So we're not talking about every type of operation or every type of facility under the sun, just those 1 through 8, and only when they're seeking an applicable permit. So the next step after that, once we determine that yes, this application that's come before the department is subject to the environmental justice law, the next step is that it's going through an environmental justice impact statement. So we are requiring the applicant to put together a statement, a document that explains the potential environmental and public health stressors that are already associated with the facility. So what types of stressors or what types of pollution impacts by proposing to be located in this community will that facility bring. They also need to talk about the environmental and public health stressors that are already experienced or that the community is already experiencing. So because of the cumulative nature of many different pollutants, we know that some communities, Black and brown, low income, our environmental justice communities are experiencing pollution already. And then facilities are coming in and maybe causing to more pollution. And so there may be a disproportionate impact even before the facility moves in. And so they need to talk about the pollution that they will be causing and the pollution that's already existing. And again, our EJ map kind of tells you that second piece of what is already existing within the community. And then they need to talk about, if the permit were to be granted, what would they do to minimize or reduce those sources of pollution? And in order to get to that step of the department making a decision, they need to be meeting with the overburdened community. And so this is a shift. This is a paradigm shift in the way that we do and the requirements that we have for our applicants, is that usually the DEP or the department will have a hearing about the permit that's under review and will invite the public to provide testimony and to comment, to say what they think about the permit. The shift now is that we're requiring applicants to go to the overburdened community, to go to their host community and explain and defend in front of them why they think they should be located or why they need to be located within that community as opposed to anywhere else, right? And so that engagement and that conversation should be had with the community, and then we will take into account the discussion that's happening in the meeting, all of the written and oral testimony that's provided, and the department will make a decision. I'll talk about how we propose to do that in a minute. But this shift that is happening is we're placing the burden on the applicant and we're shifting it from the community to have to show up and come to the table with solutions. And they may have solutions, and that's great if they do, about what can happen in the absence or if the applicant is coming to the community, solutions about what can be built instead, right? We're shifting that burden to the applicant to defend and explain the solutions that they can bring forward to the community. And so that doesn't typically happen. What typically happens is the applicant comes in, they meet before the department or they meet before local government. Those discussions happen outside of the community. They get their approval. And by the time the community hears about it or has an opportunity to say what they think, they've missed the moment, and all of that is intentional. So we're having conversations or requiring the applicant to have conversations with the community up front before any other discussions about permits are being asked. So just want to run through really quickly the 26 environmental and public stressors, and these serve as the background for the analysis that's being done within our environmental justice mapping tool. So we stakeholdered this. We had a list of about 60, I think, environmental and public health stressors, and then ended up with 26 of them, mostly because we wanted to pick stressors for which there was a publicly available and accessible data set that we could pull into our tool. So don't have time to go through all of them, but they're concentrated areas of air pollution like ozone and PM 2.5. They're mobile sources of air pollution like traffic and railways. Point sources of water pollution like combined sewer overflows. Solid waste and scrap yards. Contaminated sites. And then we have a list of stressors that may cause public health issues. So just want to spend a moment about this to explain what we mean by this. So instead of looking at health outcomes within our environmental justice communities, so the rate of cancer or the rate of asthma, that can be really hard to determine what source, so from what facility has caused that cancer or has caused that asthma risk, right? But we know that in those communities, there is elevated occurrences of those health outcomes. So, and because the data to tie those linkages together is often limited and being robust enough to base our government decisions off of, we're using proxy stressors that may cause public health outcomes, and that we think is enough to withstand any lawsuits that we'll get about the underlying determinations of data that we're using. So we're looking at drinking water quality, we're looking at the age of housing, right? Because we know that houses built before a certain time may have lead paint, and that lead paint may cause a health outcome. So we're not looking at the percentage or the number of communities that have lead poisoning, we're just looking at the housing because we know that that is a known data set. So lack of recreational open space, lack of tree canopy, and so on. Okay, so at this step, the department makes a decision. So we take into account all of the information that has been shared at the public hearing with the community and with the applicant. We're reviewing the EJs. We're making a decision based on if the new permit is requesting, or if the applicant is requesting a new permit, we have the authority to deny that. If a disproportionate impact is apparent and present. And for a renewal of a permit or an expansion of a permit, we have the authority and are charged to set conditions on that permit based on the findings that we find within the environmental justice impact statement. So this is here for you can read through it. I want to move forward to just think about and expand for ourselves the other opportunities to advance and further environmental justice beyond what our environmental justice law gives us. And so when we think about, the root causes of systemic injustice, kind of going back to that systemic nature of the injustices that we're talking about, I often like to say that we're not blaming any one individual for causing racism or for causing the experiences or the occurrences of racism that are experienced by our communities. But what we are saying is that if you think of a system and you think of government as one example of a system, we know that governments are made up of agencies, and agencies are made up of divisions and bureaus and offices. And those divisions and bureaus and offices are made up of people and managers and staff, right? And those managers and their staff make decisions every day. They make decisions every day about our public health, about our safety, about our environment, right? And so it is really incumbent upon us as people that have influence over whatever our sector is to think about the specific and individual role that we have in stacking and stepping up to that system of people making up offices, and offices making up bureaus and divisions making agencies, and agencies making our government system. And so you could probably do that same thought exercise for the public health system or for the university system, right? And so within our sphere of influence, what do we have control over to be co-conspirators in the fight against injustice, and not just settling for, well, you know, I as one person can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions or reduce the co-pollutants, but there may be some step that stacks up to a health outcome or a health solution, a health outcome that will be a solution for our environmental justice communities. So the Office of Environmental Justice thinks about the systemic nature of our work, you know, beyond the environmental justice law, but we think about it in the furtherance of everything that we do of our mission as an agency. So we think about our work under 3 priorities. The first being the ways in which we are amending the work that we do every day within the department. So beyond the regulations and the permitting and the siting piece, right, we also receive money from the federal government and we grant that money out to communities. So where are the opportunities to make sure that we are granting money to those who need it the most, just as way of example. The way that we do our compliance and enforcement activities and so on and so forth. It's all about all of the opportunities that we have to further environmental justice, not just through the regulatory piece. The second is taking that approach of where we're being deeply vulnerable about everything that we do and the opportunities to further environmental justice in everything that we do, and applying that to state government, because it's not just about the Department of Environmental Protection, although we have a very obvious role to play, but it's also about the Department of Transportation. We know that there's a whole long history of highway racism and highways being built through and around communities that have separated and discriminated against those communities. And so the legacy of that as an example. So there's a role for all of state government to play. So we're approaching this with a whole of government approach with an interagency council for environmental justice that is really having these conversations about how to incorporate EJ into everything that we do in furtherance of our mission. And the last is, we cannot do environmental justice efficiently if we're not engaging and discussing with our communities to really learn and hear from their lived experiences and use that work and use that feedback to color the work and shape the work that we do every day. And so this is my last slide. I just want to leave you with a few bullet points that you can look at your own, but I just left some resources for you about learning more about the principles of environmental justice, learning more about the Department of Environmental Protection and the Office of EJ. We have a newsletter that's sent out every 2 weeks where you can keep abreast of all of the opportunities to comment on the environmental justice law and the hearings that are happening. So I encourage you to sign up for that. And really just taking the opportunity to incorporate environmental justice into your sphere of influence, really applying an EJ lens onto what you do, and never being afraid to speak up and stand up when you have an opportunity to insert EJ into the conversation, whether it be at your local planning board meeting or a zoning board meeting. There's so many environmental decisions happening every day, and you have an opportunity to really shape those conversations and invite those who are most affected by those conversations into those decisions. So with that, thank you.